Welcome to an installment of CCSD Living Environment. Today we're going to look at biodiversity and all of the multifaceted things that go around that topic. Biodiversity is a very complex idea. The definition may seem simple, but all the things that affect biodiversity are relatively complex. Biological diversity, or biodiversity, is the total of the variety of organisms in the biosphere. The same way diversity means how many different things do you have, biodiversity is just referring to how many different living things do we have. Biodiversity is one of Earth's greatest natural resources. The problem is that most people don't think about biodiversity as a resource. We don't think about all of the different organisms being in our environment as a resource, but it truly is. Ecosystem diversity and species diversity encompass most of what ecologists are trying to preserve. It's not just about reducing the pollution, it's also about making sure that we have these organisms, the diversity of the ecosystem, the diversity of the species. Biodiversity has contributed to both medicine and agriculture. Losing the vastness and importance of this research may actually be detrimental to our population. So we have all of this research in medicine and agriculture, but if we lose the biodiversity that's giving us those answers that we're doing the research on, that potentially could be very harmful to our population. Many of the medications that we have come from other organisms. If we lose those organisms, where does that leave us? The variety of organisms and the size of populations present in an ecosystem both affect the stability, productivity, and complexity that an ecosystem has to offer. The ecosystem is only as strong as the organisms within it. The more options you have, the more stable that ecosystem is going to be. For example, if you have a cornfield versus a forest, if something were to come in and take out the corn, that takes out your whole ecosystem. If something comes into a forest and takes out one species of tree, you still have all the other trees there that allow that forest to continue. The diversity of the ecosystem, how many different things are there, the number of species and the amount of those species is very, very important. Humans reduce biodiversity through habitat destruction, hunting, introducing invasive species, polluting the food web, and playing a part in climate change. There's so many ways that we affect ecosystems and that we affect the diversity of organisms within that ecosystem, we don't even think about them. When we build a house, what have we done to the ecosystem that was in the area where someone built a house? Or where we built a shopping mall? Or where we put up a tower? All of those things, what is the effect on the ecosystem of that area? What did it do to the biodiversity? What organisms have we changed or lost because of the action that we did? When natural habitats are altered for agricultural or urban development, the number of species in those habitats decreases. Development often chops up an ecosystem into pieces. Smaller pieces mean fewer population numbers and fewer populations in that area. Think about when you develop a town or when you develop something like, say, Fort Drum. Originally, before any of that started, before we developed any houses in Carthage or before anything came onto Fort Drum, granted it's years and years and years ago, when that first happened, yes, there was changes and things adapted to that environment and they continued on. But when we start adding and we keep getting bigger, we're chopping up that area. We're fragmenting the habitat. We're fragmenting the environment. We're chopping it up. So now instead of there being a wide area where you could have deer or bear or squirrels, whatever it is, now there's a little bit of wooded area over here, a little bit of wooded area over here, maybe a little bit down here. And what happens? Those animals have to walk through our area or where we're now living or shopping or whatever it is, and people aren't necessarily overly excited about that. Maybe it's causing a car accident. Obviously, we don't want that to happen. Maybe they're eating your garden. That's not something that people really like either. But what is the cause for that to take place? Well, we've chopped up where they were living, and they're trying to get maybe to a water source, or maybe they're just trying to find food because we've taken all the other food away. Smaller numbers increase vulnerability of species to other disturbances. Think about that. If you have a large population, you're more protected just by the numbers you have. If we start taking your population numbers away, you're more vulnerable to things happening to you. So this idea of chopping up the environment or chopping up the habitat is called habitat fragmentation. It limits biodiversity and the potential size of a population. Hunted species are more susceptible, and keep in mind they lose their hiding places. Not only are you more susceptible because I've split your population possibly in half or in thirds, but now all the places where those little bunnies may have hidden, or where the deer had to go sleep, or where the squirrels could hide, whatever it is, you've lost those hiding places for those organisms. They're more susceptible not only to predation, but to being hit by a car, maybe to humans hunting. Whatever it is, by changing their habitat, by changing their environment, we're changing how they can live and the success they have living in that environment. Another example of something that humans have done that affects the biodiversity or the number of species in an ecosystem is overhunting. Overhunting means that more organisms are killed than can possibly reproduce, which could lead to the endangerment or extinction of those animals or organisms. Maybe it's not always animals. It could be plants or something else. So what do we mean by endangerment? If something's endangered, it means the numbers that should be there in the population or that used to be there in the population has drastically reduced. And if we don't do something about that, if we don't stop the hunting or whatever's happening to them, then their population is going to stop because we're taking away the opportunity for them to live, reproduce, and continue their species. Examples of that would be the passenger pigeon, the dodo birds, which unfortunately did go extinct. We ended up killing all of them completely to extinction. And the American buffalo. Now, as we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, way back in pioneer times, the buffalo were there. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that were moving across the country killed them. Now, yes, sometimes they got used, but not always. It was more just the sport of killing, which unfortunately put the American buffalo in a very dangerous place as far as the number of species goes. It almost took the population away completely. Another example is something that we call species exploitation. If you exploit something, what does that mean? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm hoping that you're thinking it's a bad thing. If we exploit something, we're basically using it to our benefit. So with species exploitation, the destructive use of wildlife, which could be flora or fauna, remember plants or animals, by humans. An example could be the African elephant. What did we exploit them for? Their tusk. Pacific walrus, again, what did we exploit them for? The tusk, the ivory, that's what we wanted. Did we do anything with the rest of that massive walrus or that massive elephant? No. That was totally for our benefit. That's all. Humpback whales, they wanted the blubber for the oil, and the trees of the tropical rainforest. At one point along the way, they were cutting down trees of the tropical rainforest like for plywood. Well, how on earth does that make sense when we could have a pine forest that we're cultivating for that purpose? So really, when you look at these things, what was the benefit to us using them? Just because we wanted to. We were completely exploiting those species, and it was really hurting the environment or the habitat in each of those ecosystems. Because remember, every organism relies on and is dependent upon each other. So when you start changing the ecosystem, when you start changing biodiversity, you're really destroying some major aspects of an ecosystem. And that takes us to this idea of invasive or exotic species. Non-native species that can cause harm to the environment, the economy, or human health. Invasive species come from all around the world. And as international trade increases, so does the introduction of exotic species. There are organisms that don't belong here, but they're here. There's organisms that don't belong other place, but they've gotten there. An example would be in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico used to have a snake problem. And I don't know if when you were a kid you read the book Rikki Tikki Tavi or not, but Rikki Tikki Tavi was a mongoose. Well, mongoose kind of have this thing for snakes. They're a predator of snakes. So they said, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if we brought the mongoose from the United States to Puerto Rico to clean up the snake problem? Yeah, great idea. They don't have a snake problem anymore, but now they've got this huge mongoose problem. They're all over the place. They can't get rid of them. Why can't they get rid of them? When you bring in an invasive or exotic species, that invasive species can compete better for natural resources than the native species could, and there's no natural predator. If you don't have a natural predator, what's going to control your population? When you run out of the thing that you were eating, you're going to find something else. And you can compete better for all of the resources than the native species could. In a sense, you're stronger than they were. Another example of that came from Eurasia back in the 1800s, and it's called purple loosestrife. We find it around here all the time. And we find it in places where you might find cattails, which are a native organism. The cattails grow in those kind of marshy wetland areas. Purple loosestrife is the stuff that you see usually by August, and it's got these nice purple flowers on them, and everybody just thinks they're so pretty. It's an invasive species. It's choking out the cattails. It's taking away the natural resources from the cattails, and it doesn't have a natural predator here. So what happens? It overruns the cattails, and it kills most of them off. If any of you have headed for Syracuse and gone across I-90 toward Buffalo, you've driven through an area called Montezuma State Park. There was a huge purple loosestrife problem in Montezuma State Park. And what they did is they came in and they tried to clean up the purple loosestrife, which they did do, and now many more of the cattails have come into that area. If it wasn't for that effort, we would have seriously been in a problem, and we would have lost that natural, native ecosystem. There would have been a loss to biodiversity. That takes us to this idea of a biocide. What does bio mean? Bio means living. What does side mean? Side means to kill. So a biocide is a chemical that's used to kill living things. Many times biocides have negative effects on organisms they were not targeted to kill. So before we look at the examples, let's talk a little bit about this idea behind a biocide. There's something there that I don't like, and so I'm going to buy a chemical and I'm going to spray it on it to kill it. So if you want to kill an insect, what do we call them? An insecticide. If you want to kill a plant, what do we call them? An herbicide. If you want to just kill some pest, whatever you find to be a pest, we would call that a pesticide. So again, side means to kill. The problem with using chemicals is that the chemicals then get into the environment. Now, we spent some time earlier in this unit talking about biomagnification, and hopefully you remember the fact that as you move up the food chain, the amount of that toxin increases in the food chain. So by the time you get to the top, you've got a lot of whatever that toxin was. So what we don't think about is, though, you're spraying a little bit of chemical on the plant that you want to kill, but then each time that the animals that eat the plants or the animals that eat the animals, each time we step up that food chain, more and more and more are you causing damage to that environment. An example would be DDT, which is what we talked about when we did biomagnification, affecting the bald eagles. We talked about the osprey. Same thing with the bald eagle. They both eat the fish. So you've got all this DDT in that aquatic environment, gets into the fish, gets into the eagles. Again, it affects how they lay their eggs. Another one is Agent Orange. Agent Orange was something that was around in Vietnam. They created Agent Orange because it was an herbicide. It would take the leaves off the trees in the jungles of Vietnam. Great idea. Well, the problem was they didn't realize at the time the effect Agent Orange would have on humans. Agent Orange is a carcinogen. It causes cancer. So here we are using it in an effort to make things better at the time, but we didn't know the long-term effects. We didn't know what that chemical was doing. So now let me ask you this. Is it always best to use a chemical to take care of a population? And do we always want to take care of populations? Or should we let nature do some of that? Well, in the case of an invasive species, we probably want to take care of that population. But would you recommend using a chemical? Do you think that's the best way to solve the problem? And I'm hoping your answer to that question is no. The fewer chemicals we use, the better for the entire environment it is. So if we're not going to use chemicals to control these populations and to take care of these problems, what are we going to do? We're going to use something called biological control. If you're controlling something, you're kind of keeping an eye on it, you're keeping things in check, and remember, biological, we're talking about something living. So here's the idea with a biological control, and this is pretty cool. It's a method of controlling a pest population using another living organism. It relies on predation, parasitism, and herbivory. We talked a little bit about purple loosestrife. I gave you the idea behind purple loosestrife. So there was a gentleman at Cornell University that did some research on purple loosestrife. And what he found was that if he went back to where purple loosestrife was native, there were organisms that ate purple loosestrife. There was a beetle that ate the flower, a beetle that ate the plant part, the green part, and a beetle that ate the root. So they did all kinds of research, and they brought them in, and they brought the beetles here. Now, obviously, we don't want to bring in another invasive species if it's going to cause a problem. So they did all this research with the plants and the beetles. And they put the beetles on the plants. And then they said, okay, what organisms are you going to find around here when these beetles eat all the plants and there's nothing left? So they put other organisms in there. The beetles ate all the plants, all the purple loosestrife, but they never touched the native species. So what they found is that those beetles would actually only, in fact, eat the purple loosestrife. That's a biological control. We're not hurting the environment by releasing those beetles. Now, it took a lot of research over quite a few years to do that. You don't want to release an invasive species to fix an invasive species, or then you're really in a bigger problem. That, by the way, is how they did clean up Montezuma State Park. They brought the beetles in, the beetles cleaned up the purple loosestrife problem, and now the park is back to a relatively native ecosystem. That's great news. Natural enemies of insect pests, also known as biological control agents, include predators, parasites, and pathogens. Another really cool thing that they came up with, speaking of biological controls, is instead of setting a trap for an insect using a chemical, again, we want to get rid of those chemicals, they used a hormone trap. So they took the hormone from the male or female insect and put it in this trap. Attracts the opposite species, they get trapped in there, they can't get out. Did we use a harmful chemical to the environment? No, but we used something to control that species population. One term that we need to define in here is a pathogen. A pathogen is any disease-causing agent that enters the organism. So we may give a wasp, let's say, a pathogen that's going to kill the wasp, that it won't hurt anything else in the ecosystem. That's okay. So what is a pathogen? Anything that comes in and causes a disease. For example, if a bacteria gets into your body and it causes you to be sick, we would call that a pathogen. It has entered your body and it has made you sick. Now, obviously, if we're using it as a biological control, we're going for a parasite, we're going with parasitism, and we're hoping it's going to kill it, or at least significantly reduce the population. To conserve biodiversity, we have to protect individual species, preserve habitats and ecosystems, and make sure humans living near the protected area benefits. And you say, well, wait a minute, if humans are causing all these problems, why do we need to make sure that there's a benefit to humans? Well, because unfortunately, if we say we're going to make a whole lot of changes to things that are happening, and there's no benefit to the people living near there, they may not buy into it. And if people don't agree with what you're doing, they're not going to help you get the job done. So we really need to make sure that we're preserving the habitat and the ecosystem, but that people can see some benefit to them. If you tell people we're taking your hunting privileges away completely, they're not going to like that very much. But if you say we're going to make a season where you can hunt, we're going to give you a certain number that you can hunt. So we're not taking the privilege away, we're just changing the regulations around it. And that's so we can preserve these species. Protecting biodiversity often demands that individuals change their habits or the way that they earn their living. The challenge is protecting areas that are large enough and contain the right resources to protect biodiversity. So really the biggest thing and the hardest part about doing this And I think many of you can see there's a reason to protect biodiversity. There's a reason to protect the organisms that are out there. The problem is that it affects people. It affects what we do, how we do it, where we do it, when we do it. And in some cases, it affects people's way of life. It affects how you make your living. It affects your job. So we need to be really, really careful when we make laws or when we make regulations in an effort to protect the environment that we don't completely change how people live. It's a very delicate, again, a very delicate balance between what do we need to do that's right for the environment and what do we need to do to still allow people to continue on. Conservation efforts in the past have focused on individual organisms using programs like captive breeding. So you go to a zoo and we breed at the zoo. Is it the best thing? Well, natural is always better, but if your population's down to almost nothing, I guess at least there's one or two. Reintroduction of maybe wolves or some other predator, possibly reintroduction of some other organism that should have been in the area, but it ended up getting choked out by an invasive species. So we reintroduce them. Creating an endangered species list. That was a great thing that the government did. They came in and they said, okay, listen, if we continue to affect these populations, there's not going to be any left. These organisms on this list, you can't hunt, you can't touch them. And if they live in a certain place, you can't affect that environment. Because if we don't do something, we're going to have more and more and more extinct species. Conservation on a larger scale has included creation of national parks, sanctuaries, whether it's a marine sanctuary or maybe a terrestrial or land sanctuary. Sometimes a bird sanctuary is just an area of land. It's not always a marine or aquatic sanctuary. And finally, other protected areas. So it may not be a national park, titled national park. It may not be titled a sanctuary, but it's still a protected area. You can't go there and do whatever you feel like doing. Now, yes, you get to a place and you say, I'd really like to go and four-wheel across that or snowmobile across that, but it's posted and you're told you can't. The reason for that is because there's some organism there that if we continue to use that environment for our needs, again, exploit that environment, then we're going to take out those populations. And that really is a big concern. The more diversity we have, the more different organisms we have in an area, the healthier that area is, the more stable it is, the more complex it is. The greater your complexity it is, the more stable you're going to be. If something affects one population, it doesn't take out the entire community. And that goes back to the cornfield versus the forest. If you affect a corn plant, we wipe out the whole thing. If we affect one tree species in the forest, the rest of that forest will continue on. And those organisms will be able to survive. So biodiversity is probably one of the planet's greatest resources. So I hope this allows you to think a little bit about biodiversity, and maybe in your daily life there's changes that you can make that will affect population. Recycling is a big one. Reduce, reuse, recycle. That's a huge thing that we can do on an individual level that would really truly help on a global scale. Thank you for watching. Have a great afternoon.